Welcome to Prajim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 8 of ADO.NET video series. In this session, we'll learn about the purpose of SQL Data Reader, creating an instance of SQL Data Reader, reading data using SQL Data Reader's read method. Before continuing with the session, I strongly recommend to watch parts 5, 6 and 7 of this video series. SQL Data Reader reads data in the most efficient manner possible. So if you ever have a need to read large amounts of data within your application, SQL Data Reader should be your choice. SQL Data Reader is read-only and forward-only, meaning once you read a record and go to the next record, there's no way that you can go back to the previous record. Meaning, if I'm reading 10 rows from the database, if I have read the first record and if the cursor has moved to the second record, then there's no way that you can go back and read the first record again. So it's read only and forward only. Read only meaning you cannot use SQL Data Reader to change the data. Okay, so this forward only nature of SQL Data Reader is what makes it more efficient. Okay, so and another important thing is that SQL Data Reader is connection oriented, meaning it requires an active and open connection to the data source while it reads the data. An instance of a SQL Data Reader cannot be created using the new operator. This is very important to keep in mind. Let's actually look at that in action. So here I have a table called TBL product inventory, which has got these three columns: product ID, product name and unit price. I want to display this data in a grid view control in an ASP.NET web application. So I have a simple ASP.NET web application here, and within the web.config file I have the connection string to the database. So the name of the connection string is dbcs. So obviously we need to read this connection string in our web application, and to do that we use the configuration manager class, and the configuration manager class is present in system.configuration namespace. So make sure you import this namespace before actually using configuration manager class. So configuration manager dot connection strings is the property to which we have to pass in the name of the connection string, and the name of the connection string here, it's dbcs. So dbcs dot connection string. So that gives the connection string. So let's create a variable called cs, standing for connection string, and store that within that. Now we need to create a connection object, and to create that I'm using the using block. Using block ensures that the connection is properly closed in a timely fashion. As soon as the connection object goes out of scope, it gets automatically closed. We don't have to explicitly call the connection.close method if we are using the using block. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection, and to this constructor of SQL connection class we have to pass in the connection string. So let's pass connection string. Alright, so we have the connection that's required. The next thing is basically to open the connection. So let's call connection.open, and now we need to prepare the SQL command that we want to execute using the SQL command class. So SQL command cmd is equal to new SQL command, and the constructor of SQL command takes in two parameters: the command that we want to execute and on the connection on which you want to execute that command. So obviously the command that I want to execute is this SQL command. So let's copy that and pass it to the constructor of the SQL command class. And the next parameter that it expects is the SQL connection object, which we already have here. So let's copy that and paste it here. We have spoken about the SQL connection and SQL command objects in the previous sessions of this video series. So if you're new to them and if you don't understand what we are doing here, please check those video parts first before you continue with this session. Alright, so we have the SQL command object. Now the next thing is obviously to execute the command, but then before that let's create a SQL data reader object. Usually to create any object, we say, for example, here we're creating an instance of SQL connection class. The way we are doing it is we are using the new operator and then obviously a constructor of that class. So SQL connection con is equal to new SQL connection class. So we are using the new operator to create an instance of this class. But can I do the same thing for SQL data reader? Let's see what happens if we try to do that. So SQL data reader RDR is equal to new SQL data reader. Okay, now let's build the application. Go to the build menu, build solution, and let's look at what happens. Look at this. We get a compilation error stating that system.data.sql client.sqlDataReader has no constructors defined, meaning it's complaining that you basically cannot use the new operator to create an instance of SQL Data Reader because it doesn't really make sense. Okay, so I mean, what will you do with this is of no use when I mean, why do I ever need a reader? I need a reader to read data from the database. So obviously the command.execute reader method executes the command, creates an instance of SQL data reader, loads it with data, and returns that back to you. Okay, so that's why if you ever need to create an instance of SQL Data Reader, you generally don't do that using the new operator. You do that using the execute reader method of the command object. So command.execute reader. And if you look at the return type of this execute reader method, it's SQL Data Reader object, which means the execute reader method is going to create an instance of SQL Data Reader for us. Okay. So we got the reader object. So that's what is important to keep in mind. An instance of SQL Data Reader cannot be created using the new operator. The SQL command object's execute reader method creates and returns an instance of SQL Data Reader. And another important thing to keep in mind, SQL Data Reader is connection oriented, and the connection needs to be opened explicitly by calling the open method on the connection object before calling the execute reader method of the command object. Otherwise you will get an error, a runtime error stating that an open connection is required. So here if you look at this one, if you don't open the connection and if you try to execute the statement, you will get a runtime error and not a compile time error. So the SQL data reader requires an active and open connection when it actually reads the data. That's why you have to explicitly call the open method on the connection object before you do that. But there is another way to access data, which is using data adapter and data set. It's called disconnected data access model, which we will be talking about in our next video session. Alright, so we execute the command, we get the reader, and let's say I want to display this data in a grid view control. So obviously we need a grid view control. Let's drag and drop it from the toolbox. So I have the grid view control, and to make it look better, auto format that, select one of the schemes that are predefined. Okay, so I have the grid view control whose ID is grid view 1. Let's copy that. Let's go to the code behind file, and let's say gridview1.data source is equal to RDR. So we are setting the data source of the grid view control to this reader, and finally call gridview1.databind. Okay, so obviously now if we run this application, the data gets read from the database using the reader object, and that will be displayed in the grid view control as expected. Okay, so we get all the columns and rows. Fine, but there is one thing that we still need to do. Here we are closing we are not closing the connection, but we have wrapped that inside a using block. So this connection is going to be automatically closed as soon as the scope is lost. Just like how you are closing the connection, SQL Data Reader also needs to be closed in a timely fashion to ensure that your application is scalable and performing better. So when you use a SQL Data Reader object, make sure that gets properly closed. Okay, so obviously to do that, what you can actually do is you can wrap that inside another using statement. So using SQL Data Reader, RDR is equal to wrap that inside this using block. So what's going to happen, as soon as the scope of this RDR object is lost, that will be closed in a timely fashion. Okay, so basically there are two ways to close a reader or a connection object. One way is to obviously use this using block, which will automatically close the connection and the reader. We don't have to call explicitly the close method on those objects. Another way is to use the finally block. Finally block is guaranteed to execute irrespective of whether there is an exception or not. So the connection or the reader, if you wrap that close call on these objects within the finally block, they are guaranteed to be closed. Okay. Alright, so basically this is the simplest way of binding a reader object to a data source, to a grid view control. But then let's say if there is ever a need for you to loop through each row within the reader, and then if you want to perform some row by row processing, okay, then how do we loop through, you know, all the rows that are available in the reader? How do we do that? In SQL Data Reader, in SQL Data Reader class, there is a read method that we can actually use to loop through each row in that reader. Let's see how to do that. Actually, what we will do is, if you look at the table that we have here, it has got product ID, product name, and unit price columns. Now what I want to basically do is, in the grid view control, I want to display those columns, the product ID, name, unit price, and along with that I also want to show the discounted price. Let's say we are giving a 10% discount. I also want to show the discounted price, 10% on the actual unit price. So I want to do a row by row processing here, which means I have to loop through each row in the reader object, in the SQL Data Reader object. So how do I do that? Using the read method of the SQL Data Reader object. So let's see actually to achieve this. Okay, so now I don't want to directly bind the result of this reader to the grid view control. So let's comment that for the time being. We'll come back to that in a while. So I want to loop through each row in this reader object. So how do we do that? We can use the read method. So while RDR is the instance of SQL Data Reader dot there is a read method, and look at the signature of this read method. It returns a boolean value, a true or a false. This method is going to return true as long as there are rows in the SQL Data Reader object. The moment it comes to the last record, and if there are no more records to read within the SQL Data Reader, that's when it returns false and it comes out of the while loop. And within the while loop, you can actually perform the row by row processing that you want to do. Okay, but before that, so obviously I want to do a row by row processing and then store the processed rows in a separate table. So I want to create a data table, okay, so that I can store the processed rows within that data table. And to create the data table, I can use data table. And another important thing to keep in mind, this data table is present in system.data namespace. So you need to import that namespace using system.data. Okay, so data table, let's call this table is equal to new data table. And if you look at the output, how many columns you want in the output? I want 4 columns. So you want to add these columns to that data table. And the way to add columns to that table is table.columns.add, and then you can specify the name of the column. Okay, so let's say ID. And similarly, I want the column for name of the product, unit price, and the discounted price. So let's call this name, let's call this price, and the final column as discounted price. Okay, so we have all the columns that are required. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a new row within this table. So I'm going to say table.newRow. There is a method called newRow which will return, if you look at the return type of this newRow method, it's going to return a data row. So let's create a variable which can hold that data row. So data row, let's call this data row. Okay, so we have the data row. Now what we want to do is first compute the discounted price. So how do I compute the discounted price? First let's get the original price. So int original price is equal to, where do I get the original price from? Look at this, while rdr.read, this read method reads the first record and returns it within this while loop. So it reads the first record the first time. So RDR, and look at this, there are two ways to retrieve the column values. One is to use the integral indexer. You can pass 0, 1, 2, but then your code will not be much readable if you do that. Or you can use the string column names. So if you look at the column names, the unit price column name is unit price. So I'm going to pass unit price. Okay, always use column names because it makes your code more readable and hence more maintainable. And obviously we know that unit price is an integer, so we need to convert that to integer. So convert.toInt32. Alright, So we have got the original price, and then let's say we are giving 10% discount. So we want to calculate the discounted price. So discounted price. So how do we compute the discounted price? If we are giving 10% discount, then the discounted price will be 90% of the actual original price. So I'm going to multiply this original price with 0.09. And obviously if you multiply that with 0.09, you will get a double. So let's make this data type double. Okay. So we have the discounted price and the original price. All we have to do now is to populate the data row. So data row of ID is equal to, we need the original ID from the reader. So I'm going to take that. So what's the column name? Product ID. Let's copy that, paste that there. And similarly, you need the values for name column. So name, and what is the original column name? Product name. So we're going to pass that here. And finally the unit price, and in the data row the column name is price, so paste that there. And finally I want the discounted price, and discounted price is not coming from the database, we are computing that in the code. And where do we have that? We have that here, discounted price. And actually, instead of getting it again from the reader, since you have already got the original price, I will use that variable and populate this. And another important thing that we need to do, so you created a data row, you populated the column values for that row. So obviously you need to add this row to this table. So we're going to say table dot rows dot add. So to the rows collection of that table, add a new data row. Do we have a data row? We do have a data row. So copy that and pass to this add method, which will be added to the table. So now what's happening here? It will process each record within the reader and then add it to this table that we have created. And then what we are going to do now, we are going to use this table as the data source for our grid view control. Instead of the reader object, I'm going to use this table. That's it. Uncomment these two lines. Now if we run, look at this. What we are doing here essentially is looping through each record within the data reader object. And how are we doing that? Using the read method. Okay, so let's run this and see if we get the discounted price. So the output should be like this, the actual price and the discounted price. So we get the original price, discounted price. Now you might be wondering, do we really have to do so much to actually display the discounted price? In reality, you don't have to do this. You can slightly modify your query, and all this code would be gone. Okay, let me actually show you, the best way of calculating the discounted price. You can actually, change that in the query. So you have the unit price, and then unit price multiplied by 0.09. Now this whole thing will give you 10% discounted value. So as, give it a meaningful column name, discounted price. So if you look at your query, you're getting discounted price now. What you can do, execute this query and bind the reader to the grid view control. Let me show you that. So let's close this first. So all that code will go away. Now what I want to do, I can take this reader and bind that directly. And we have to change the query. So let's copy that query instead of this one. Let's paste that. So now if I run the project, you will see the discounted price as expected. But then why did we use read method? I know that is just to demonstrate, how to actually loop through each row in SQL Data Reader. It's possible using read method. but then the same thing can also be achieved by modifying your query. Usually within ADO.NET there will be more than one way to do it, so depending on your situation, depending on what we are trying to achieve, we choose one method over the other. But the idea here is to understand that it's to loop through each record in a SQL data reader object, use the data reader's read method. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening.